Going live. Hello and welcome. And boy, do we have a tenuous theory for you.
Mhm.
So I'm here with Mike, and we're discussing the problems of economics and economic theory. Uh, so what happened was recently I read this very good book called Debunking Economics by Stephen Keen, and it opened my mind to just why the argument with the free market people, it tends to be so just bizarre. I'm all against that stuff. So, and this was just like explaining, like this is an amazing book because it explained to me why exactly, I have such a hard time understanding these people. You know what I mean? I've heard people say just like, oh, libertarians, you're using such bizarre logic, and just like, yeah, that's because the foundations of economic theory themselves go against common sense. That's why you have that. So it explained a lot of a lot of why the arguments that we were having didn't actually end up like working. So in essence, what this book basically explains is that pretty much all of economic theory that's taught in schools, in undergraduate and maybe in high school, everything that's taught is basically completely wrong. All of it is just not founded in reality. It has assumptions that don't make any sense, that don't represent the real world in the slightest. And as a result, you get a theory that is at odds with common sense at every turn. Mike here actually is a graduate student, or was a graduate student in economics. So he can tell you more specifically about how he was inculcated into the free market cult only to eventually escape it. How did that happen?
I think I went into it. I was already skeptical, so it was only a matter of time before I decided to just like bounce out of it.
Yeah, but you were Austrian.
Yeah, that's true. I guess initially I was Austrian, so I was skeptical of neoclassical on the basis of Austrian, but then I became skeptical of Austrian as well.
Yeah, but Austrian. I mean, we could talk about like Austrian some more later, but Austrian is not like that different from neoclassical. It's just no math and like that's it.
Pretty much,
and,
yeah,
and
and they're more prone to certain errors because they don't use math. But
yeah,
yeah.
which makes it feel even more as if they're ideologically motivated.
Mm.
Um, when economics is a science that you can explain with math, and a lot of the laws, like Say's law, has a mathematical like representation. So you're just
Yeah,
going to say none of the math matters. It's like, okay,
they're implicitly using math, even if they don't know it really.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, they'll tell you in economics classes that some of the stuff is just like a little doesn't really apply in the real world, or this is ceteris paribus. We have to assume that. Have you heard that phrase, ceteris paribus?
Yeah. Right from the beginning, they talk about ceteris paribus.
Yeah, ceteris paribus just means if you have a supply and demand graph, they're saying that graph is only valid when everything else is held fixed.
Mm.
That's what ceteris paribus means. And they just have all these little techniques to swivel away from the truth.
Mm.
And they will say stuff like, oh, macroeconomics doesn't really quite work the way we say that it does, but it's still useful as you learn more, greater, better economic theory. Does
Yeah,
it?
it's always like pushed off like, oh, later on you'll learn like the real theory or whatever, but then that never really happens, like at least in my experience. I mean, maybe the real theory is like after you already get a PhD, and then I don't know. I don't think that there is.
There is a real theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, because we did learn the basic dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. That's like the main theory that they use.
Which says what?
Basically it's so in undergrad you'll learn partial equilibrium, which is supply and demand, ceteris paribus, and then general equilibrium expands that across all markets, including both buyers and sellers. And then dynamic just makes it, makes it across time, basically. So you have, it accounts for infinite future time. And then stochastic just accounts for random shocks in the system.
Yeah, but how does it actually like account for any of that stuff is my question.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really account for time so much. I mean, it's still just like periods of time, equilibrium in 1 year versus equilibrium in the next year.
Oh, okay. Really, so you're going from one equilibrium to another, and
yeah.
Okay, so that it still makes no sense.
Pretty much.
Good. So equilibrium, equilibrium doesn't really exist, is what you find out. Like it's what I found out. Oh, actually, no. Here's what I'll say. When I got into economic theory, when I took first year economics, this was like a year ago. I was I never really understood what they were saying about markets. I never got the sense that, where supply intersects demand is necessarily where social welfare is maximized.
Mm-hmm.
I never got that sense. I just thought, oh, this is just where the graphs happen to intersect. This happens to be whatever price the consumer will accept, right? And the producer, this is what happens to be whatever price the consumer and producer will accept. But there is nothing in that equilibrium that seemed particularly good to me. I just thought this is just this is where they happen to intersect given how they behave. But is this actually what's best for them? I mean,
yeah. I mean, economists themselves abstract away from that question because they don't really want to answer that question of what's best. So that's why they use the Pareto optimality condition. So and which is almost true by definition in a market, because people are going to be trading presumably because they both think they're going to be better off, right? So that means that under Pareto optimality, no one is made worse off, in other words. So that's their condition, is the market is best because no one is made worse off by it. And it doesn't really say anything about anything more than that, about it being best overall, because they don't want to make any kind of comparisons between different people's utilities. So that's kind of off the table. So the Pareto optimality is just such a minimal condition. It's just if I gain 1 cent from the trade and the other person gains $1 million, then that's a Pareto optimal trade.
Yeah, I mean, that's just that's ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. You can use that to have a model and look at the model and be like, oh, this is neat. But to use that to try and derive some sort of ethical stance on what's best for society, that doesn't make any sense, because you are essentially saying that this is objectively best for society, whilst not actually answering the question, what is objectively best for society? You avoid the question, but give an answer to it anyway.
Pretty much.
It doesn't make any sense. That's just one of the ways it doesn't make sense. This is why I found free market people. There's a million ways in which it doesn't make sense, and now I see why. It's literally, it's like its own religion. Keane basically describes it as a religion in his book. So let's go into the SMD conditions, because this was the first thing. This is the first thing he talks about, and this was the first thing I realized. It's just oh my god, of course.
Yeah,
of course they have to assume this, right? Pretty much. Keane points out how there's this theorem in economics called the Sonnenschein.
Sonnenschein. It's almost like sun and shine. Sonnenschein.
Sonnenschein. Okay. Yeah. The Sonnenschein Debreu. Mantel-Debreu theorem, SMD.
Yeah.
Which pretty much says there's a whole bunch of conditions that need to happen in order for the market demand curve to have a negative slope. And those conditions are what? The indifference curves have to be the same for all consumers, and there can only be one good in the market. So it's effectively modeling one person and one good. Yeah, like that's
like
there's a theorem.
Consumers just collapse into one consumer.
There's a theorem in economics that tells you that in order for the theorem to work, you need to have one person and one good. Like a communist super world where everybody is somehow the same and trading in just one thing.
Yeah, it's just like incredible to think about, like this is actually what they're assuming. And like when I did actually learn about the SMD theorem in graduate school, but they didn't really like focus on it and like take it to its full implications. It was just like, okay, well, here's this theorem that we're assuming. Okay, moving along. But it was like, wait a second.
Yeah. It's funny. Oh God, my favorite chapter in his book is called "Don't Shoot Me, I'm Only the Piano," because he talks about how they like use mathematics incorrectly, and it's hilarious. The SMD theorem is literally a proof by contradiction of why economics doesn't work. Of why the demand curve doesn't look anything like this negatively sloped line. It can have apparently I don't think it was this theorem, or maybe it was this theorem. It points out how the demand curve can actually have any shape. It can have any polynomial shape. A polynomial is just it can look like a parabola, a cubic function, or a quartic, quintic, etc. It can have crazy shapes. Pretty much any function, any analytic function can be like approximated with polynomials, and it can look like that. So long as it's
certain conditions, like I think as it approaches zero, like it has to approach negative infinity or something like that. Boundary conditions. Yeah, it has to be zero at zero.
There's one boundary condition, and it can't like double back on itself, and like it can't do the thing that functions don't do anyway. Like it has to be a function basically.
And that's the excess demand function, which is like a little bit different from the demand function that we learned in Econ 101, which is like that doesn't really account. That's only like from the perspective of well, like in general equilibrium, people can be either producers or consumers, and they're both producers and consumers, right?
Yeah.
Whereas in Econ 101, you see the demand curve and then you see the supply curve, and it's like separate people. So it, like general equilibrium kind of connects the two things, and then it turns into this excess demand curve. So that if it's negative, then you want to sell that thing, and if it's positive, you want to buy the thing.
And you're saying excess demand can have any shape?
Yeah. And but like that also, I think means that the supply and demand that you learn in Econ 101, I think that also means it can take any shape, but it's kind of difficult to
it would have to
link up the two things, like the excess demand function, general equilibrium, with the partial equilibrium graph, because that ceteris paribus thing doesn't really hold, because as you move up and down the curve, then wealth effects happen, so that shifts the curve. So you can't just move up and down the curve without it shifting. So I think that's the sense in which it doesn't really stick to that, like, supply curve slope up and demand curve slope down, because it doesn't account for wealth effects, which are accounted for in general equilibrium.
Right. Wealth effects. Oh yeah, there's also the thing where there's certain assumptions about what wealth effects have on your consumption pattern, and the assumptions are that there is no effect. Your income pretty much says if your income increases, then you will consume more of the good proportional to whatever, right? Like the goods have to be homothetic, which means that the income effect just increases the amount, but you don't substitute away from them, or so if I'm buying 10 bananas now, my income gets multiplied by 10, then I'm buying 100 bananas. And if I'm a billionaire, then I'm buying, millions of bananas because I'm just hungry for bananas. And I'm not buying them to sell, I'm buying them to consume. So
Right.
it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
There's not a single good that's like that.
Mm.
Like almost every good, oh God, this is just like the tip of the iceberg. But yeah, when I read this, like the third chapter of Keen, he's like, this SMD theorem, and I'm just like, what the hell is this? There's a theorem in economics that is a proof by contradiction of how the supply and demand theory demand theory does not work in this way.
And it basically means that unless you make that assumption, then the equilibrium is not going to be unique or static, I think. So there could be multiple equilibria. Who knows which one the market might go to?
Yeah, there'll be multiple equilibria because the curve will, you're not going to have two linear curves that intersect in just one spot. You're going to have some crazy, oh, Jesus.
Yeah.
You can have some crazy ass curve, which can intersect in numerous different ways. Yeah, so that's just and it really boils down to like common sense at the same time, because if you look at the assumptions that have to be made in order to get that curve, you're just like, whoa, hold on a sec. And just like first year micro, it's like, no, this doesn't apply. When in reality does this actually like hold? You also have to have that assumption of completeness, which is like, if a person enters like a supermarket, then they basically know their own utility map, how every combination of goods, they can compare it to any other combination of goods and just know which one's better. So
that would just exceed the computational capacity of like, I don't know, supercomputers to have not only take into account all the possible different goods, but all the different possible combinations. I mean, there would be more combinations than there are atoms in the universe, or like way more than that, exponentially more.
Yeah, there could be Googleplexes of combinations. Like it's like you have to know. It's like, okay, if I have 5,000 strawberries and 4,000 bananas, then I know exactly how much that is compared to say 6,000 boxes of cereal and 2,000 apples or something. Just like, exactly. Who knows, what human being knows how to compare quantities that large? It's like, no, we make decisions based on just like some heuristic of like what is good for us in the moment. What do we need for next week?
I think that I mean, the three possible relations with preferences are, prefers, like you prefer A to B, or you prefer B to A, or you're indifferent, right?
Yeah.
So I think like an economist might try to defend this by saying, well, okay, if you don't really know what the combination is, then you're just maybe indifferent. But I think that would kind of throw a wrench into what they're trying to do with deriving the demand curves, because in practice, like when they do derive like preferences and use that to derive the demand curve, in practice, they're kind of assuming that there is like a certain slope to the preferences. There's not like parts in it that are unknown or indeterminate or something.
Yeah, it means at a certain point the demand curve just gets it just becomes flat, right? Right. And this also ties in the whole thing where it's just like people are assumed to be hedonists and to have like infinite they just want an infinite amount of everything. I want millions of bananas right now.
Right.
I have nothing to do with them, but I want them anyway.
Yeah.
And I just like, I remember having, remember Brian, right? I'm going to bring him up as well. There's one reason I really like this book, because it explains like every disagreement I had with the guy. I was telling him once, it's just like human beings don't have infinite preferences. I straight up say this because it's like saying human beings have infinite preferences really, in some sense, it is true, but at the same time, it's not a realistic statement whatsoever, because it gives you no perspective as to how people have the preferences that they do, and how much of a certain thing that they want, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want an infinite number of bananas in this, in this moment, right?
Yeah. I think that economists, I mean, they do assume diminishing marginal utility, I guess, but like it becomes asymptotic. So like you still always want bananas. It's just that like the utility you get it from it would be smaller and smaller and smaller, but you'd still want more and more. So theoretically, if you could, you would buy an infinite number of them, even though like on that very last banana, you're hardly getting anything at all from that last banana, but you're still getting something. So
but there's problems with that. Well, like at a certain point, I can't consume bananas anymore because I would just explode, right? Like, and if you're gonna say, and this is when this goes into like the next problem, which is like, what are you actually using the bananas for?
Mm-hmm.
Are you just consuming them, or are you using them to sell, or are you going to consume some of them now and then the others later? You know, if you're going to ask questions like that, then all of a sudden this is a dynamic system with dynamic rules, and you can't analyze it with the static equilibrium where there's no time variable, which is what they do.
Right.
And it's just, and again, this goes like every argument I've ever had with a libertarian has always boiled down to just like, the market is going to do this, the market's going to allocate resources there, it's going to correct itself, it's going to do all this stuff, and just like, well, how long is that shit going to take?
Yeah.
Like this could take years, it could take hundreds of years.
Yeah, because like the key thing like that struck me like in my economics education is they never really had a theory of how the market gets to equilibrium. They have a story. The story is shortages and surpluses. Like if there's a shortage, then basically the price will go up, and then if there's a surplus, then the price will go down. But it's never really theorized. It's just like basically just explained to you that this is how it's gonna happen.
Yeah, but what if that like hasn't happened yet?
Yeah.
Like what if there's still shortages and surpluses out there in the economy? Then we're in disequilibrium right now, and you're using equilibrium laws to analyze disequilibrium. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And also, if the excess demand function can have any shape, then that whole argument of the surplus and shortage only works if the demand curve slopes down and the supply curve slopes up. Otherwise, that doesn't really have any meaning. Like if supply is sloping down and demand is sloping up, that mechanism wouldn't work, I don't think.
You mean if they're both sloping up?
Or if it was like opposite from each other.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is like, again, this is just like the surface of the problem. I've noticed like my arguments with libertarians would usually get to a point where I'm just thinking, it's like, wait a second, the stuff they're describing might work in like if we already lived in a utopia, if we already lived in a world where resources were like distributed perfectly, but we don't live in such a world.
Yeah.
And this explains why, is that they're thinking that we're in an equilibrium, or that we were at one point, or that we somehow there's no. Yeah.
To be fair, the Austrians think that we're always in disequilibrium, but I think that implicitly they're always assuming that there is this equilibrium that we're moving towards, even though we're not like there ever. There's always one equilibrium that we're moving towards, and like the market is in some sense close to that.
Yeah, but how do the problem there is, how do you know that the market goes there?
Yeah.
Right. Like, how do you know how we move towards equilibrium? So, I mean, the Austrians fall prey to the same thing. Like, the Austrians are weird. They don't want to do the math, and they don't believe in equilibrium, but they still praise capitalism for what? According to Keen, it's because of like the evolutionary merits of capitalism. How innovation and entrepreneurship is a good thing, and in a market these things are allowed to operate as efficiently as they possibly can, and when they operate it'll lead us closer to equilibrium. But how do you know that all entrepreneurship does that?
Yeah.
How do you know that all innovation does that? you know.
Yeah, it's because they don't like explicitly detail out the theory like mathematically. It's almost like they're relying on a kind of like muddiness, or like muddying the waters, or like it's not really clear like how the things connect with each other, like the entrepreneurship and this supposed market equilibrium that we're moving towards, but we never get to. It's not clear how I mean, like I want to read this guy Kerzner, who is I guess one of the more respected Austrian economists, and he has this whole theory of entrepreneurship and stuff. I mean, I don't really know that much about it, but yeah, I mean, it's not clear to me, at least, how that would occur, or like why that would necessarily result in the best possible outcome.
I can almost guarantee you that Kerzner is not going to have a good answer to that, because in order to answer that, you need to not have a subjective theory of value.
Yeah.
If you stick with that, you're not going to get anywhere. Like, the subjective theory of value is just a way of avoiding any question that could ever show up of this type. It's just like, how do we know that there's good or bad innovation? It's just like, well, it's all equally good because value is subjective. That's like,
what's interesting though is like Rothbard. I mean, Mises was totally about subjectivism, but Rothbard was like an objectivist when it came to morality, and then a subjectivist when it came to economic value. So I'm not really sure how he linked up, or how he reconciled those two things.
He doesn't, because he doesn't understand what value is.
Yeah,
that's why they're all like, all these, like the Steph bots, the Molinites, they're all just like, yeah, morality is objective, and it's objective because it tells us the market. It's a contradiction, because you're saying that the market is objectively better, but value is completely subjective.
Yeah,
the value of anything in the market is subjective. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
right? Because then what's the value of the ideology, right? If value is subjective, like the ideology has a value, right? And if that value is subjective, then all of a sudden the ideology is no better than any conflicting ideology.
Yeah.
And the theory breaks down. So, I mean, you can't, they're getting into crazy territory because they're trying to avoid answering the question. I want to avoid talking about the theory of value for now, though, because that's probably the most interesting thing that was in here for me. Let's move on. So, okay, Keene also points out how the supply curve doesn't even exist, which is just badass. He's just like, here's your theory, assholes. The demand curve has any shape. The supply curve doesn't exist. Microeconomics is a lie. I don't fully remember or understand the chapter on why the supply curve doesn't actually exist.
If I remember right, doesn't it have to do with declining or increasing marginal cost? Yeah, I think that's its argument, is that economics assumes increasing marginal costs, so therefore, like people will produce more or less the higher. Wait, yeah, I'm confused now. It's been a while since I read it, but like he says that it's the opposite is true, that marginal cost decreases as you produce more
in the short run.
Yeah,
in the short run, they assume rising marginal costs, falling marginal productivity. And he says this is false, or that this guy Sraffa had a critique of this, which pointed out that this was false. In the short run, marginal cost is actually falling because they're not firms are not going to be using, like, in the short run, they're going to have extra machines that they're not going to be using. And what economists are saying is, it's like, if you have 100 machines, effectively what you're going to do in the short run is you're going to put a guy on each machine. Whereas what actually happens is that you don't put 100 guys on each machine. You put like 5 guys on the first 20 machines, because that's more efficient. And you have some extra machines that just aren't doing anything. Or like, maybe not machines, maybe land is the fixed variable in this case. But the point is, you're always going to have some excess in the short run. So, and this whole like short run, long run shtick is, again, it's the whole, there's a general problem with economic theory, which is that they forget that time exists. Time doesn't matter. We're always in an equilibrium or headed towards another equilibrium, or there's the only thing keeping us from equilibrium is the government for some reason.
Yeah, I think Keen had a good analogy where he was like, it's like learning to ride a bicycle. Like you learn to ride it all at once, and somehow it has to work all together, right? You can't just learn it without moving. That doesn't work. Like you can't learn the motion of one wheel and then also the motion of the other wheel. It has to like work all together somehow.
Yeah.
And economists try to split it up too much, and it doesn't work.
They try to split it up, and they don't try to run the machine. I mean, the aggregation problem, which is in the SMD theorem, that's one thing, but the time thing is even worse than that, because it's like it's so against common sense, right? That this is why every argument for me felt like I'm up against a brick wall here. It's like you're assuming that the economy is in the middle of a black hole somehow, where everything happens at once, right? Like where relativity is taken into account, but you're assuming states of being that may not have ever been achieved.
One example is the rational choice assumption.
You have to assume for people to be rational, they have to know every price change that will ever happen in the future.
Yeah.
Right. And investors,
or just even the idea that you have to, like, in order to decide something, you have to work everything out to the infinite time horizon is just absurd. Like, I just think at that point, it just completely divorces from any kind of human psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Humans don't make decisions based on calculations. They have heuristics that we evolved to have, and they make decisions with those heuristics.
Yeah.
That's why like evolutionary economics, which is like the new field that's pretty small, is they're trying to look at it from that perspective. The thing is, Mike, when I was learning it in university, I was thinking, all right, the stuff clearly doesn't apply all the time, but it's got to be useful. It's got to make sense, on some level. It's got to explain something. Why else would it be taught, right? Does it explain something?
I mean, it doesn't really. I mean, like in the 2008 recession, I mean, they just had no idea that was coming at all. So to me, that indicates that it's not really applying to reality, because otherwise they would be able to see that coming,
They don't know. They didn't know the recession was coming, but were they right about certain other things, like increasing the minimum wage increases unemployment, or
I mean, the studies on that have been very mixed. Like some studies show that it doesn't reduce unemployment at all. Others do. It's not really clear. And even if the theory were true, it doesn't really say how much unemployment would be caused.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. I mean, yeah. At the end of the day, you're just like you're trying to talk about maximizing social welfare, which isn't even a well-defined thing. Which is why I like Keen's approach, because he's basically saying, like, fuck all this philosophical shit. Let's just look at money and what it's doing, because that's the only thing that we can agree on is objective, right off the bat.
Crazy, because like the neoclassicals completely ignore money. They think that money is just basically just has no effect, because it's just an intermediary between trading one thing with another thing. So therefore, it can be ignored, and therefore you don't have to model money at all.
But that's more like that's more static thinking.
Yeah.
Because again, like, people can just hold on to money for years and not trade it in for anything, and that will have some sort of effect. Like, again, everything doesn't happen all at once. Everything doesn't happen in equilibrium.
And I think that's what Keynes was trying to get at with his theory, that money like does make a difference. And people will hoard that money, and that will prevent aggregate demand. That will prevent Say's law from occurring.
Yeah.
And aggregate demand will shrink and stuff. And he was trying to articulate that argument within the confines of neoclassical theory. But I think that the reason why it didn't really work was because neoclassical theory reasserted itself and was like, well, wait a second, these Keynesian assumptions, these are too arbitrary. Like, let's just have micro foundations and then just have everything work together. And then like it really just
it was
like
John Hicks who was just like, oh, I think Keynes just meant that this is all just like micro, right?
Yeah.
That's what he said. No, but I think Keynes said that Keynes was actually saying the same thing Marx was saying,
Yeah.
but he tried to state it in a convoluted as hell way because
Yeah.
he didn't want to be branded a Marxist, which would have been bad for his career.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, Keene goes into a lot of detail about just the sheer pedagogy and pedagogy and like the tampering and with the just dishonest behavior from neoclassical economists as they throughout history, as they ignored proofs of their own theorems or proofs that their theorems didn't work, or as they they took what this one guy said and ignored what he said completely and turned it all around to fit this model. It's sick in a way, and frightening. It's like I don't know. It's a very sort of religious kind of behavior. And then you have Milton Friedman. Okay, so let's talk about Milton Friedman's whole assumption shtick. The assumptions don't matter. Yeah, this was stupid as hell. This is Milton Friedman's statement about assumption is the dumbest thing I've ever read. Like, it's like the assumptions don't matter because like if the theory can predict things, then that's good. But what can it predict? It didn't predict the Great Depression. It didn't predict the Great Recession. Or he wasn't around. And in fact, they tried to they couldn't even control the inflation rate.
Stagflation.
Yeah. So I mean, it not only does the theory not predict anything, but like again, there's a whole chapter in this, but it's just like it's ridiculous. There's different kinds of assumptions, right? You can have a simple theory that doesn't hold in reality at all as you get to a more like constructive theory. That's what they do in physics is they have like they start with some simple assumptions and they try to make things more complicated.
Right. But it has to be made complicated enough to actually fit the situation. Like you're not going to like
to approximate the situation.
Yeah, it has to be like enough, like complexified enough so that it approximates the situation. And if it's not complexified enough, I mean, it seems like to me that economists they continue making these simple assumptions because the math would just be intractable otherwise. And like that's what it comes down to is like, for instance, the reason why they assume that there's an auctioneer in the Walrasian general equilibrium is because like if people set prices independently, that would make the math just like way too complicated. And it's just like easier if we decide on one price for all time, all at once. Right. Even if that's like not realistic at all.
But then you have to, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just saying, I just think that they have this kind of faith that is analogous with what happens in real life, but they don't really have any evidence or proof that is analogous to what actually happens.
What I was going to say is if they're going to do that, then they have to be very careful about whether or not this theory applies in real life and where it can apply. Because you can't just assume that it does apply. It's what Keene pointed out with domain assumptions is they don't know that this stuff applies in real life. So they don't know where this theory actually applies. Their assumptions might be so insane that the theory doesn't actually apply to the capitalist world that we currently live in.
And see, the thing is, like, they can, like, when I got into more of the advanced modeling in grad school, there's all these, like, little parameters you can tweak, you know? And, like, I think what they do is they tweak those parameters to make it seem like it fits with the data, and then it kind of, like, fits for a little while until something catastrophic happens. And then that wasn't accounted for at all.
They try to make the data fit the theory.
Right. Yeah. Or it's kind of like that, like this error of, you can make any theory, you can tweak it, and if you add enough additional theoretical
variables,
material or variables or what, you can always make that fit the data. But then the question is, if that doesn't really reflect the underlying reality, we don't really have any reason to think that that's going to continue to hold true.
Yeah, and I mean, trying to fit the data with like from this microeconomic perspective is just never going to work, because it's because of chaos theory, which, to their credit, while Ross and like Alfred Marshall and all those guys, all the early economists, they had no idea about any of this.
Right.
Even the guys before the Great Depression had no idea what chaos theory was. It wasn't until like the 50s, 60s where it was developed, and where people really sort of figured out how nonlinear like dynamic modeling works in mathematics. And now it's useful in other fields, but the economics hasn't adopted it yet. And this is actually what Keen is trying to do. He has like a whole like website where he's trying to use nonlinear modeling to predict predict when recessions are going to happen in the economy. So they didn't have the tools. So, to their credit, they didn't have the tools, but they did have the religion still. Like they weren't skeptical enough that maybe their tools don't actually, maybe what they do have doesn't actually work.
Yeah. I mean, on some level, like, we have to remember that we're dealing with like human beings, and like human beings and brains are just so complicated. There's like 100 billion neurons, and like there's just so many factors. And like, to reduce that to like a simple equation of like of preference relations, like that like a human can be just modeled as a series of preference relations that are like in some sense static. Like the idea is to like divorce it from psychology and human behavior. It's like we don't have to think about all that stuff, because we're just going to think of it in terms of this is just a series of preference relations. But like that just doesn't work, because if you don't have any theory of how the underlying human actually behaves, then you have no basis for assuming that those preference relations are going to be static anyway. Because like, of course they're going to change when based on all these factors that you're not taking into account due to human psychology and so forth.
Right. Yeah. I mean, to assume that anything human beings are related with is going to be linear just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And I mean, that's like ultimately their excuse came down, why they didn't predict the recession was, well, okay, it's a technology shock or like a preferences shock. So in other words, people's preferences change. We have no idea why, but that's why.
People's preferences change, but then you don't have a model of people's preferences then.
Yeah.
If people's preferences can just change like that, like it doesn't yeah. So Keen has a lot of other chapters. He talks about wealth distribution as well. He points out wealth distribution is literally just a social construct. Why some people get paid more than others, and that labor cannot be treated as a commodity like everything else. It doesn't necessarily have a negative demand curve. It could have a positive demand curve. The supply curve can be negative. Like it, that's like actually something that they do teach in labor economics, is that the backwards bending labor supply curve, because if people work a certain amount, then they're gonna, if they're paid more, then they may want to work more, but then after a certain amount, then they want to work less, because they're like, well, I already have enough money, why don't I have more? I'll just take more leisure. And actually, like, I remember reading somewhere, I forgot where, but I read recently that like initially when capitalism developed in certain areas where there was like strong pre-capitalist traditions, like they had a lot of trouble getting them to work more by just paying them more, because every time they tried to pay them more to incentivize them to work more, they would just work less. Yeah, of course they would. Like, where did this idea come from that people want to work more if they get paid more?
Yeah.
It's just insane.
Yeah.
And again, here's another thing where the whole here's another place where the whole static thinking comes into play. The idea is that if people are working less, it's because they're spending time on leisure. But that's not that's not true, Like, look at homeless people. They're not spending all their time on leisure, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you could hardly qualify that as leisure.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
I also think that this, like, at the core, like, economics assumes that work is a disutility, right? And I think that on there, like right there, it kind of disrespects like how humans think of work, and I think that that's a very like instrumentalist way of viewing it. Like, we only work just for the money.
Yeah.
And like I think that
it's also not
the
true.
ideology of that is just like part of what's wrong with capitalism. This idea of just like things have no worth in themselves. We're just gonna go use it just for the end of like.
But that doesn't make any sense, because what is the end at that point, right? Like, things have to have worth in themselves.
Yeah.
You can't escape some idea of like intrinsic value.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I'm just like, oh, and this is another argument I was having with Brian. I'm just like, dude, like, physicists aren't working for the money. They're not doing it just to like maximize the amount of money they're making. If they wanted to do that, they'd go into finance or some shit.
Right.
Right. Not into academia. Like, what are we doing right now? Are we trying to maximize the amount of money we're making, you and I?
No. Not exactly.
Not in this discussion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that like this whole idea of work as like this is like a sacrifice that you make in order to get money. It kind of goes down to that Protestant work ethic or something like that, where you're like punishing yourself in order to gain God's glory or something. But like somehow like we have that ideology now where like the more people work, the more value they're perceived as having. And like, so people are expected to like spend their whole lives doing something they don't really even enjoy, just for basically increasing the profit margins of someone else. And that's seen as a good thing.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I hate capitalism.
Yeah.
Because work is not work itself has intrinsic value for some people. Some people love their job, right? And that's not taking into account the amount of money they make from their job.
Yeah.
It's not being quantified. And this whole thing is, again, it's again static versus dynamic thinking. They're saying it's like, if you're not working, well, it's because you're spending time on leisure. Well, what about poor people? Does that mean that they're just spending all their time on leisure? That doesn't make any sense. They don't have any money to spend on leisure, right?
Yeah, and it's not like it's not something you have a choice over either, because I mean, a lot of places the amount of time you work is decided on by your employer. You don't really have a choice. I can't just choose to work 20 hours one week and then 60 hours the next week. I have to work the 40 hours, every week. So like it's kind of a fiction that you can even choose that.
Yeah. And I mean, you could say perhaps that well, people work for X amount of time, X number of years, and then they spend the next few years on leisure where their income goes down. But I mean, then that's dynamic modeling, not static. And so you run into the same static problems, right? And that still doesn't explain how there's people who want to work now that aren't working, and how there's people who aren't spending their time on leisure because they don't have money and aren't working either, right? Like, you don't, whatever. And you still don't explain the whole marginal like the marginal product of their labor thing is where their income comes from. But
I think that like that's another fiction of economics, is that we can assume, or we can figure out exactly how much value each person contributed, and we can pay them exactly according to that value. I think it's all like a mixing pot thing.
You can't do that, and
everyone's work mixes into the pot, and there's no way to separate it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's consequential, right? Like, if I grow an apple and a CEO eats the apple, then I contribute to his productivity dynamically. It's static versus dynamic thinking. Everything doesn't happen all at once. It happens dynamically. So the things people do today will affect the productivity of people tomorrow, but it won't be factored in. And this is why, and Marx was actually thinking about this with the labor theory of value. Labor theory of value is completely wrong. but this is what he was talking about. He was trying to say like, well, wait a second, it's labor that has actual value, and other things don't. Like machines don't have value, and capitalists don't have value. It's just the labor itself.
Mm.
But again, it's just like non-dynamic. There's a bit of non-dynamic thinking there, and there's also the whole thing of people's tendency to like separate human beings and machines and just other things into like different metaphysical categories, of which like the subjectivists and the Austrians are also guilty of. Marx was doing the exact same thing.
Yeah.
So yeah,
I think that like it's really complex, because I mean, just think of like a cashier. Like, how could you quantify the value that they produce to the organization? Because if it weren't for that cashier, or if it weren't for the cashiers, nothing would get sold. So then you have zero value, right? So if you remove that one variable, then you have no value at all.
Yeah.
Right? So like there's no way to run an experiment where you take that factor out or that variable out and then run it without that and see how much value is produced.
The problem is
everything is interconnected and codependent.
Yeah, they're trying to figure out what is intrinsically valuable, but they're like, that's like looking at things that are extrinsically valuable. Like extrinsically valuable, meaning that their value is not in and of themselves, but of the consequence that they have.
Yeah.
So a cashier has extrinsic value, doesn't really have intrinsic value. So then the question is, well, what things actually have intrinsic value? Well, that's like a philosophical question, right? There's no answer to that. And Marx did not come up with an answer because, I mean, yeah, the labor theory of value, it's nice because he was trying to say it's just like, oh yeah, the laborers are the most important. But really, I mean, I guess we could go into more detail now, but it doesn't make any sense. It's just like, well, what if there was a robot who could do the same thing that a laborer could do?
Yeah.
You know?
And also, like, it doesn't, like, Marx, in a way, just wasn't radical enough in his thinking, because he assumes that the value that something gets on the market is its real value. That, like, essentially the only issue is, okay, we're selling corn for $5 a bushel or whatever, and, like, capitalist takes $2 out of that, and the laborers only get $2 or $3, and then if the laborers got all $5, then problem solved. But like that doesn't really question at all, is that really the value of the corn? Because he just takes that at face value, basically.
Yeah, he didn't answer that question, and I don't think anyone's answered that question. But he got closer to it. I mean, give him credit where credit is due. He got closer to it by defining the difference between exchange value and use value. There's a difference there. Honestly, and I think use value can't really be quantified. Exchange value can, but that's just more. I mean, that's just sort of more evidence that capitalism isn't exactly a fair system.
Yeah.
Because there's no reason to think that exchange and use value are ever the same. And Keene brings up a good example. It's just like, well, when the settlers first came to North America, they bought the island of Manhattan for like a couple of beads from the natives. I mean, see, the weird thing with the libertarian people is just like, you have to literally think that that's a fair trade because they agreed to it.
It benefits both parties. What's there to complain about?
Yeah, exactly. The other guys got some beads.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's just like, it's so just against fundamental idea of fairness and when a trade, like, can a trade ever be unfair?
Yeah. I mean, I was reading this David Graeber book called 5,000 Years of Debt, and he was talking about like all these different ancient societies and how their markets worked and stuff like that. And it was very interesting because it was saying that, you know, certain things could be traded, and he was talking about this particular African society, but like basically like trading things was viewed as kind of like a woman's job, and like so she went to the marketplace and traded certain things, but the guys were not concerned about that at all. They were concerned about getting these brass rods, which were like symbolic of their social power and so forth. And basically, like they wanted to accumulate these brass rods, but the brass rods, there were very specific rules about what could be traded. And like a brass rod was like, it could be used as like a dowry for marriage, or it could be used as like a kind of compensation in case you accidentally kill someone or something like that. But like the two things could never intersect. Like the world of the markets and goods could not intersect with the brass rods trading, because that was like more of a symbolic thing that had to do with people's like honor and stuff like that.
Yeah. So I mean, clearly, then this isn't a new idea that that use value and exchange value are not the same thing,
Mhm.
right? And like again, it's at the core of everything, and you literally have to assume that that isn't the case. But here's the thing: libertarians don't believe in that either, because if they encountered a trade that wasn't fair, and then they'd find out how unfair the trade was, like a year later, they'd be pissed off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
They would stop being libertarians in a heartbeat in that second. They'd be like, wait a second, that wasn't a fair trade.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the entire system breaks down.
Yeah. And they also think that there are certain things that can't be traded, right? Like they don't think that you can trade yourself into slavery, presumably, right? You can't just become a voluntary slave.
But then that means there's a difference between use value and exchange value right there.
Yeah.
If there's some things you can't trade, like if I go to fucking Stefan Molyneux, I'm like, buddy, how much will you like pay for your? How much will do I have to pay for? How much do I have to pay you to have your daughter?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, let me buy your daughter from you. You know.
Yeah, I mean, according to libertarian theory, there has to be some price at which you'd be willing to part for your daughter, even if it's like $1 million or $1 billion. Yeah, there has to be some price.
Not okay with anything I do to her, then I can just pay her more money until she is okay, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So presumably there's a point, there's a certain point where I can pay her enough to let her for her to let me kill her.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
and like that's another thing that libertarians don't really get about what the left wing is saying about exploitation and the capitalist workplace and stuff like that. It's just like on some level, I think people on the radical left just don't think that human time, our time, is something that can be traded like a commodity. And I don't think that libertarians understand that at all, because they do view human time as a commodity. And
except not when it suits them.
Yeah.
Not when it's the case of abortion, not when it's the case of like, even if I can't voluntarily sell myself into slavery, even like, or maybe I can. It depends on who you talk to, but it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But the fact that there is this difference between use and exchange value, the fact that it's there is like, this is where objective value comes from. Is you need to sort of figure out this difference. You need to figure out to see where use and exchange value diverge, and where they diverge, that's where you have something that is sort of intrinsically valuable. And that is something that people should simply try to maximize. There's places where it obviously diverges, like in the case of children. And most people would not want to trade their children for anything, right?
Yeah, so by exchange value, you mean that like whatever price the thing could obtain on the market.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's weird to say like children have a use value, but I mean, use is sort of a very broad term. It could mean anything. Like they have an intrinsic value that has nothing to do with whether or not you can trade them. Yeah. And there's plenty of things in that category. I think art is another thing that's in that category, which is why we should try to create more art.
Yeah.
And, which is why capitalism often gets in the way of that. Like, just the whole thing is conflating exchange value with use value.
Yeah, it just I think that like before capitalism, there was more of a space for basically human economies where there were certain things that were treated with intrinsic value, like in that example of the African community I was talking about, like that you couldn't just pay someone money or whatever they used for money if you accidentally killed someone, because it was it was perceived as something that you could never pay back. You could never make up for the fact of killing someone, you know? So like you couldn't be compensated. I mean, you would give them like maybe one of your brass rods, but it symbolically, that didn't mean that you were paying them back. It just means it was a symbolic acknowledgement of like that you owed them a debt that could never be repaid.
Yeah.
You know? So like, I think that things like that, like certain rules of like how we interact, like I think that there always needs to be a human economy, and like capitalism wants to abolish the idea that there can be a human economy.
Kinda. Yeah. It's a very anti-human, it's very nihilistic in its own way. And because nihilism is just like, you say everything's subjective and then you don't have to do any work. And you can just do whatever you want. And it's exactly what they're doing, because they're saying value is subjective.
Yeah. And I think that on some level we do like create our own values. Like I'm not sure, I mean, to some extent, I guess I could see where the argument comes from that things have intrinsic value, but I think that we also like create values. So it's kind of like our job as humans to like to acknowledge our responsibility from like an existential standpoint. You know, like we can't just like the existentialist idea was basically you can't use your circumstances as an excuse. Like you can't just say throw your hands up and like whatever, nothing is valuable. It's always your responsibility to create value, and that's kind of like what an artist does as well.
Yeah.
Can't hear you.
No? Can't hear me?
No, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's not an easy question to answer. Well, what has intrinsic value and what doesn't? But it's at the heart of this whole thing. If we had an answer to that, then we'd know immediately how to organize the economy and everything. And to some extent, we won't fully know what the answer to that is. So in a sense, it's sort of just like trying to figure out what has intrinsic value by trying different things. Anyway, yeah. So, I mean, you get the point. What else does Keynes say? I'm just thinking. Nothing to lose but their minds. So he points out how economists don't use math properly. And he says a lot that one of the criticisms against against assuming the economy is in disequilibrium is thinking that if it's in disequilibrium, then that just means it would break down. But that's not how things actually work. Like the weather is in disequilibrium all the time, but you know, there's still like patterns in the climate, right? We still have hurricane season every year, right? We still have macroscopic patterns that don't disappear and aren't breaking down. So
yeah,
this was his whole argument with chaos theory, which is that there are patterns behind the chaos. Just because something is in disequilibrium, if you look at all the individual parts as a whole, there could be a pattern on a more holistic level. And chaos theory is a way to analyze that, which is something that is hard to do because it's nonlinear. You don't have straight lines. You have you have complex functions, and in a lot of cases, you can't even solve things analytically. You can't even really come up with numerical solutions. But there's still like a pattern that's there that you can.
I think that's like definitely the way forward for economics. I think that what they have to get over is this idea they want to be able to prove everything. Like they want to have an analytic closed form solution for everything, and like that's part of the whole I guess appeal of economics right now is the idea that it can be just like, you know, theorem proof, and like the idea that you can just like really understand things on a provable level. And I don't think that's true. I think that like we need to use like economists need to get better at math and using it in a way that fits the subject material, you know, and not have this fantasy that they're like actually mathematicians, you know.
Yeah, ironically, for for this whole like super hedonistic worldview that they're supposed to have. When it comes to education, they're very altruistic. They're all just like, come on in, everybody. Let's all learn economics.
Yeah.
We'll teach it to all the students. I asked an economist at one of the universities that I go to, and I asked him a question. I asked him, why do you teach this stuff when it's like presumably not correct? And he said, well, because it'll help them go further on to learn other things. But if if that's not really happening, what you're essentially doing is inculcating students into this religion that doesn't really make sense, and you're making the first few years of undergrad just simple as hell, and to pander to as many people as possible to get your religion going. I don't know, like you learned indifference curves in second year, right?
I guess the second intermediate micro, like in initial micro, we just learned supply and demand. I mean, we had a general idea of what preference curves were, but we didn't like derive them rigorously until intermediate. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I actually did that in first year.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I had like a more I don't know. Maybe I had a sort of more rigorous prof.
Yeah. But my first economics class was really dumbed down. It was just like, it was obviously geared towards the lowest common denominator because like there were like 400 people in the class or whatever.
Jesus. So. Yeah, I took it in the summer. There's only like maybe 100 people. It wasn't that many people. Anyway, what they need to do to teach it properly is to really make it harder. Stop dumbing it down. Like teach it like you're going to teach it to math students, because it's actually a part of applied math.
Yeah.
Economics. It's literally applied mathematics. It's not its own field. Right now, it's a social science, which is the most ridiculous thing ever, given how it's actually supposed to work. It's a social science that thinks it's a real science and uses math, when it debates other people in the social sciences. People in political science go in and talk about like, but the free market is bad, and these guys will be like, no, you just don't understand math, buddy. But then the mathematician comes in like, you don't understand math, buddy. Yeah. You don't understand it.
Yeah, there's kind of like imperialism that goes on where like economics is trying to colonize the other social sciences to make them all use the same models too. And like it kind of relies on this idea that this trickery kind of that they know math and that the math is superior, and that if you don't know this, then you're some kind of idiot or something. but like when actual mathematicians look at it, then they're like, what the hell are you doing here?
Yeah. Well, yeah. And then this is I was in physics, right? And I had a few friends that went into economics, and they told me that what you do in economics is just baby stuff. It's not even like, it's just so simple. They don't know any ODEs.
Yeah.
Do you know ODEs?
I did learn that in undergrad, but I didn't we used some kind of differential equations. But it was still very much in the general equilibrium context. I think that like, I'm having a hard time remembering, but basically there was like the discrete version of dynamics where we'd do like t=1, t=2, t=3, etc. But then there was another version we did where it was more continuous, and it was like based on growth theories, where we just had like the I guess so there's just a differential equation where we had like the growth rate dependent on the size of that thing of capital or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd have to review that. I don't remember, but we did use some differential equations.
Okay, well, the point is that they should start out knowing ODEs, people who go into economics. It would be very difficult because you basically wouldn't be able to send in students that haven't taken like at least first or second year in math. But that's what you have to do to teach it properly, to have it make sense, is it has to be taught more difficult. Like, because right now you just have a bunch of students go into first and second year, they unlearn how reality works, and then they leave.
Yeah.
Or they go in and they think it's boring, but they somehow get passionate, like they somehow passionately, get obsessed with the idea of markets, and go on to advise governments or whatever about how markets actually work when they don't actually work that way.
Yeah.
A small percentage, and the people who go into economics that actually like math will end up going into math, because economics doesn't do math justice,
right?
By a long shot. So, I mean, really, what they should do is make it more difficult.
I just think they need to like making the math better is like one aspect, but I think that it also needs to be more humanistic also. Like it needs to do historical investigations of like, what happened in the '08 crash and stuff like that, and needs to incorporate psychology and behavior and all this different
they
stuff.
could do that. They could do that in the first few years. If they like get rid of the curriculum that's there now with this Eco 100, Eco 200, microeconomics. Stop teaching microeconomics completely, because it's all wrong.
Yeah.
And just teach like the history of economic thought or something.
Yeah. I think that would be great. Yeah.
Teach all of this stuff as part of a historical lesson of what's happened in the past, and to see what these ideas were. But don't actually teach don't go into depth about this model, because it's not a correct model. And then when kids, third, fourth year, after they've taken enough undergraduate courses in mathematics to know what's going on, then you can start teaching them, proper models that the post-Keynesians have come up with and stuff. Yeah. So, I mean, it needs some education reform, which
well, it's kind of like, can you really teach someone something before you've really even figured it out? Like, I think that they just maybe just need to stop teaching economics until they figure out what they're doing, and then
they have figured out some things, supposedly.
Yeah,
like the post-Keynesians have figured out some things.
I guess I haven't really looked enough into what the post-Keynesians are saying.
They say they can predict recessions.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And just, well, whatever. Like, this is how it should look like. I like the post-Keynesians on the basis that they are trying very hard not to be ideological. That's like their whole thing. Is they're just saying it's like, no, we don't know anything about socialism or capitalism or which is the best system. We're just gonna try and explain what's actually here.
Yeah,
that's their whole approach.
Yeah.
Is they're not. They're trying not to be ideologically motivated. What other schools do we have? So we have the Serafians. Serafians.
Yeah.
We have the econophysicists.
I don't really know much about the econophysicists. What are they trying to do?
I think they're just trying to model the economy with disequilibrium. But they're also, Keene also said that their mistake is that they assume conservation laws apply in the economy. They're trying to apply conservation laws. Yeah, it's true. They don't value. Oh, Jesus. The fact that there's always a surplus sort of suggests that conservation laws don't really apply.
Yeah.
And we still don't know where surplus comes from, or what exactly it even is, or why it's there. But that ties into the whole intrinsic value question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it also ties into, I mean, if you think of it as a system, like the economy is a system of humans trading and stuff with each other, but at some point, the input to that system is the environment and resources, right? So that's where the extra energy, I guess you could say, is coming from. And I think that that could also be another field. We do have environmental economics, but I don't think it really takes into account the whole system, including the resources and the earth and stuff like that.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see what else. We have the evolutionary economists, which are trying to model. I'm actually not really, they're trying to model, they're trying to model the economy as an evolutionary system. Which makes sense. It obviously is an evolutionary system. They're not trying to model it based on micro foundations, which is good. because micro foundations, like you can't go from micro foundations to macro foundations. It's just like that kind of strong reductionism.
Yeah, it's like trying to determine the behavior of a car or something by starting with like the behavior of atoms or
Yeah,
something like
you
that.
don't, like, things aren't learned that way. Now, the behavior of atoms necessarily has to be consistent with the behavior of a car,
Yeah,
behavior of like chemicals, but that's not the same thing,
yeah,
right? That it's not constructed bottom up. It's discovered or constructed top down, right? We
yeah. And
start off,
I think it's super important to acknowledge that there's like social entities. Like the Austrians and neoclassicals just want to think of everything as basically just individuals in a bubble, like trading, but they don't want to acknowledge that there's like when individuals get together, that forms like a new thing that's more than the sum of the parts, some of its parts, like you like to say.
yeah,
And like, but I like to think of it as like it becomes essentially a new organism, a new thing, a new unit of analysis. Like when you put two people together, it's no longer just that person and the other
yeah,
person. It's a new thing. It's their interaction.
yeah. And between them, there is a gap of chaos. And
Yeah.
this is a point that Keene hammered in throughout this entire book, which is that you can't just reduce. You can't reduce. You can't start from micro foundations and build your way up. Every single field is learned like on its own, pretty much, and the
Yeah.
patterns are discovered through this top-down process, right? So when we talk about things like income distribution being a social construct, what we're looking at is what society, what we're noticing is how people are thinking about this stuff. We're not going from, okay, this is how the individual works, and
Mhm.
therefore the economy works like this, and there shouldn't be any unemployment because whatever.
Yeah. I guess the school of thought that I favor is agent-based computational economics. I guess what like basically you program in certain behaviors or heuristics or whatever, and then like the agents interact with each other, and then that can like create all sorts of like emergent behavior. And this is used a lot in biology to like, for example, to model the interactions between predators and prey, and how like the dynamics of that ecosystem will go like up and down, and then the populations will equilibrate. But it's not like something you can predict necessarily from the individual behaviors of the wolf or the rabbits that they hunt or whatever.
Yeah.
It's just like
I
this
mean,
like system that emerges.
you could predict if you had an infinite amount of information,
Yeah.
but if you don't have all the information, then you can't. There's actually have you heard of statistical mechanics?
I've heard the term. I don't know what it is.
It's a thing in physics where, like, when you have a lot of particles together in like a pool or something, so some
Mhm.
sort of space, you don't you no longer use Newton's laws to analyze them. You use thermodynamic laws.
Right.
You use stuff like entropy increasing or heat transfer. These totally new properties that are just emergent when you have enough particles. It's actually interesting. When there's like 6 particles or more, you start to see the thermodynamic properties emerge. When there's 3 particles or less, then you can model it with like physical, mechanical, Newton's
Yeah.
laws and stuff.
Yeah, it's like the n-dimensional problem, right? Like where you can solve certain things like computationally if you have like 3 bodies, or like I think the classic example is like 3 planets or planetary objects like orbiting each other.
Yeah.
You can calculate that if it's like 3 or less, but if it's more than that, then it becomes like non-calculable.
Actually, I think when there's 3, I think there's no analytic solution.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
but anyway, but the funny thing is between 3 and 6, we don't know what's going on. So as far as physics is concerned, the most important thing that we have no idea about is what the interactions are when there's 4 or 5 particles
That's
in a
interesting.
system.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah, that's exactly what this is the emergent properties are just being ignored because they're going from one particle to a billion particles,
Yeah.
and just assuming everything sticks. Now, because there is some reductionism, you do have to make sure that the stuff that applies to the individual is consistent with the macroeconomic properties.
Hmm.
But to observe and model macroeconomics from microeconomics makes no sense.
Yeah.
It doesn't make as little sense as the time thing. The time thing is worse, I would say, because I think time is just sort of more obvious. But yeah, like the whole is not the sum of its parts.
Yeah. I was just thinking now though that like what if there is a kind of invested interest in us not knowing how the economy really behaves? Because I mean, if you think about our system, you know, it's controlled by like bankers and, you know, like these politicians with a lot of power, the whole, and the military industrial complex and all this stuff that these power bases that really, if you think about it, don't really want themselves to be analyzed. And I think that in like economics research came out of that. Like if you read this book called Machine Dreams by Philip Murawski, he talks about the whole history of how modern economics was developed, and a lot of it was developed at the Rand Corporation, which works closely with the military industrial complex and so forth. And like, it's almost as if they really didn't want to understand how things work, because it just serves this ideological function of justifying capitalism, and like,
which is in their interest.
Yeah, and like it's too much of a coincidence that we don't understand the economy, and the powers that be don't want it to be understood, you know. So I don't know where to go with that, but
no. Well, I mean, there's definitely pressure from people who have economic power for us to not understand it, to support the whole neoclassical vision and the Austrian vision, which is why it's weird. The Austrians are against power, but they're actually, consequentially, they're not, because they're playing right into the hands of.
I mean, all that stuff is funded by the Koch brothers anyway, which is like probably, I think it's the biggest privately owned corporation in the United States. That they have like 100 billion in revenue every year or something like that, all owned by these two guys. And they founded like all these libertarian think tanks, like Americans for Prosperity is a huge one, and also the Cato Institute. And then they funded the research or they funded like Murray Rothbard in order for him to come up with his theories and stuff like that.
Really?
Yeah. So it's just so transparent.
It is now.
Yeah.
I mean, well, Keene has this optimistic perspective where he's just like, well, you know what? A lot of economists are actually like altruists. They're really good people. Some of my friends are neoclassical economists. They really just want what's best for the world. Well, that's already a contradiction, first of all, because they're supposed to be talking about a world where everyone's like a selfish hedonist.
Right. Yeah.
But I am way more cynical about this than Keene is. Like, I don't see how. I think the ones that, certainly some of them are altruistic about this, certainly. But I think the ones that are most obsessed with this are people who just don't care.
Yeah.
They just don't care about like social welfare. They love this model. They love it partially because it goes into it somehow ties into what they think a good society should be like and their personal values. And about the rest, they just don't give a shit. Yeah. I seriously doubt there's any person, you know, like myself who, or obviously there might be a few, but I doubt that there's that many people that are like altruistic and really care about improving the world that are so heavily invested.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you really did care about improving the world, like the first thing you would do is question the basis for these theories, and like that's what they're not doing. That's what they don't want you doing. And like when I was learning this stuff in grad school, it was just like basically they're saying just learn this stuff and then like don't worry about questioning the assumptions. Like basically they were saying that well like when when one of my classmates challenged them on what is it called again? The rational expectations. Like they were like, well, this is just what like Yale and Stanford and Harvard do. So like we're just gonna copy that basically.
Oh, okay.
And so like, and
That's
they're
great.
like, yeah, and so they're like, and we're not going to unless you have a better idea, we're just gonna keep doing this. And
Unless you have a better idea.
yeah. And
How about the
it's like, how do you even
fun?
so what, you're just gonna like go into Harvard and change how they do things? I mean, I don't know. It's just it's all tied in with the power complex. Like all these economists, they work their way through the system and they become like they work in the banking system or like the Fed or whatever, or like Krugman, they work with these political elites and stuff, and it's way too tied in with the political system. And I think that for it to be objective, it has to like separate itself from that political power system.
Yeah, I feel like that's also a little hypocritical for anyone calling themselves a libertarian if economics is so heavily tied into politics.
Yeah, I mean, what's his name?
Milton Friedman.
Alan Greenspan was like an uber libertarian. Like he was like as libertarian as you can possibly get. Like he was a member of Ayn Rand's inner circle, and then he became chairman of the Federal Reserve. How is that even libertarian? That's like the complete opposite of libertarianism. And yet somehow he used that as a vehicle.
Well, they're trying to create their own state.
Yeah.
They're trying to. That's messed up.
Yeah.
That's messed up. I mean, the only people you have. Well, okay, their argument is that people on the left wing and intelligentsia are also in the hands of the government because the government pays for their research.
Yeah.
That's not quite the same thing as being chair of the Fed, though.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I guess they might say he's not a true libertarian.
Yeah, of course. I mean, but in a way, like, wasn't he a truer libertarian because he just followed his self-interest, climbing it all the way to the top?
Let's not get into that shit, man. Self-interest means nothing if you use it like that.
Yeah.
Like, it means fucking nothing at that point. Literally anything can be self-interest then. I can sacrifice my life for, like, a fallen comrade in a battlefield, and that would be self-interest.
Yeah.
Well, then you've arrived nowhere at what the world should be like if you're defining things like that.
Yeah. I guess that's a discussion for another time. But
yeah. And Stephen Keen happens, I mean, he's not a socialist. He's not anti-capitalist as far as he understands capitalism, but he does support Bernie Sanders. He does tweet about Bernie Sanders all the time, and he's definitely against Donald Trump.
Right. That's good.
Yeah, I think the reason why is because, well, at least from Minsky's like instability hypothesis, the post-Keynesians were able to figure out that the banking sector is actually sort of its own thing. Like the banks don't work like normal firms do.
Yeah.
And money doesn't work as it's not just a veil that represents wealth. The banks create debt, and the debt drives the economy forward because the debt is supposed to represent future earnings, right?
Right.
But then there's a point where, because of people's future expectations are wrong, they loan out way too much money, and that creates a debt bubble, which it gets to a point where firms and people aren't capable of paying the interest on their debt. That's where the bubble explodes and the whole thing crashes. And then fucking Ben Bernanke comes in and bails out the banks. So what they're advocating for is to break up the big banks, right?
Yeah.
That's what Bernie Sanders is planning.
Yeah, and that just intuitively seems to line up with exactly what happened in the 2008 recession. Whereas like nothing I learned in economics at all would give me any kind of intuition about what happened, but that like 2-minute explanation you just did was like more explanatory of what was actually going on than all that stuff I learned. You know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't know what they teach you then, because
Yeah. But yeah, like it's so focused on the individual that like just something as common sense is like a debt bubble. Like that doesn't even have any meaning if it doesn't have micro foundations or whatever.
yeah.
And
Have you
economic
seen,
analysis.
I don't know if I asked you, have you seen The Big Short?
Yeah, yeah. I thought that was really good.
It's a pretty good movie. Um, yeah, I don't know how, like, I'm assuming like it's trying to be realistic,
Mhm.
but just the culture behind it, like they're like when uh, what's his name? Steve Carell's character goes to Florida and talks to the people taking out the loans, and he's just like, holy shit, these people, this just like random stripper owns like 5 properties. And it's
Yeah.
like, I'm sure that's based on a true story that he actually went to a strip club, that Mike Baum went to a strip club and talked to a stripper. Yeah, like don't you should just be buying a home to live in. Like, why are you taking loans and owning 5 properties that you're not going to use?
Yeah.
Doesn't make any fucking sense.
Yeah.
Like, and that's what people are doing, right? Is they're loaning out houses because they think, oh, house prices are great, or maybe I'll turn this house around and sell it for a profit, and house prices are being driven up, and then they can't pay their interest, and then bubble, you know.
Yeah. And it's basically just, it's like a game of hot potato where they're just trying to pass on the risk to the next person before the whole thing explodes.
Yeah. And it's the government's fault, of course, because the government were the ones that set the reserve ratio and the money multiplier or whatever, which doesn't actually apply to the real economy at all. It's always the government's fault.
Right.
Even when the government didn't just set it arbitrarily, it reacted to, like, it reacted to something the banks did, right? It didn't just spontaneously decide to do this for no reason.
I think it's more productive to just think of it as all one system. It's not the government or the banks. It's the bank government. It's just like one thing, because it's just like a revolving door too. Like all the Goldman Sachs people are.
Well, it's productive to think that, but then you have to acknowledge that the government is an endogenous part of the economy and not this like alien parasite that's come from outer space and just been infected us somehow. I don't understand. They think that this is like the government is just an unnatural entity, but it's been around since forever.
Yeah.
It's always been unnatural. It's always been an alien parasite. I don't
know.
But yeah, the post-Keynesians are the only they seem the most trustworthy.
Yeah.
Like the neoclassicals are insane. The Austrians are also insane.
Way too ideological.
Been more ideologically driven to the point where they don't even believe in math.
Yeah.
Keane actually says, he looks at like all the schools, he says that the Austrian one is the one he has like no faith in like, of all the alternative schools, because he could say this could just become an alternative religion to the market worshippers.
Yeah. It's just a different flavor of the same basic stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like the Marxian stuff, I think I would be equally skeptical of that.
Well, because labor theory of value isn't true.
Yeah.
It's the labor theory of value is false. So the Marxists don't know what the Marxist economists don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean there is our arguments trying to argue for the labor theory of value, and there's like this whole thing called the transformation problem, which was illustrated as a way that the labor theory of value could not possibly work at all.
Yeah,
and he goes into that.
He does. Yeah. He explains it in detail. I don't fully I don't think I fully intuitively got it.
Well, basically the idea is that like some firms will be more capital intensive and less labor intensive, right? And other firms will be less capital intensive and more labor intensive. And like the idea is that, well, if labor is the source of profit, wouldn't you expect those more labor intensive firms to be earning way more profit than the other ones? But then that contradicts with the idea, with the law of equal profit returns across all industries. Like the idea being that if profit is more in one industry, then people will redirect their investment towards that industry.
Yeah.
So it contradicts itself.
My point is the math itself, the mathematical proof, the Sarafan proof of why the labor theory of value doesn't work. I didn't fully get the proof because it's just weird. Okay, Sarafa's proofs are weird. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, Sarafa sounds pretty complex. I haven't really delved into that yet.
But like, yeah, intuitively, labor theory of value makes no goddamn sense.
Right.
However, Marx, emphasizing the difference between use and exchange value makes perfect sense, and makes perfect sense that difference exists. And Keene points this out as well. So, if you just look at that, Marx actually had, this insight is actually kind of brilliant into not only what's going on in economics, but just everything.
Yeah.
Just the purpose, the praxeological purpose of the human species ties into this question of use value, right? What is use value? Where does it come from? Why is there a surplus of use value?
Yeah, I mean, Marx was just a fascinating thinker, and I think that I like the idea of there's this idea in critical theory of going back and reading someone and getting a new reading of it, basically reinterpreting it and finding out what was in Marx, maybe even more than what he was trying to say, but trying to get at what was the real Marx, what was he really trying to say, or what could he have been trying to say, kind of expanding the idea of the implications of what he was trying to say.
Yeah. Well, the implications for me, at least from the little that I know, is that what he's getting at is an intrinsic theory of value. An objective, that there are something that are just objectively intrinsically valuable, and it's because of the existence of such things that there's a perceived difference, heuristic difference between use and exchange value, which factors into how human beings think of what constitutes a fair trade and what constitutes an unfair trade.
Yeah,
it goes into more detail, but I mean, I'd say that basically exchange value is completely extrinsic. All of it is just a measure of how far we are as a society from being in a state where everyone can maximize their intrinsic value.
Yeah,
maximize the intrinsic value of the things that are intrinsically valuable. Stuff like that, something like that. It's I see it elegantly in my head, but I can't explain it elegantly in words. But yeah, I think Marx has tons of there's plenty of interesting stuff with him when it comes to things besides economics.
Yeah, I don't think that we should, whatever we get out of Marx, it shouldn't be a dogmatic reading of his labor theory of value and stuff it should be a non-orthodox way of reading him. Yeah,
the labor theory of value is just stupid. But yeah, so other than the labor theory of value out the window, Austrians, neoclassicals, no matter, the neo-Keynesians or whatever they're calling themselves now,
new Keynesians,
are effectively not Keynesian at all. They're just neoclassicals with
sticky wages and sticky prices, basically.
Salt water, and let's add some let's add some complexity here, or maybe some malfunction. Relax. Okay, your theory's wrong.
Yeah.
The econophysicists and the evolutionary economists and those guys, I think that is still just very new. For it to work, you just need more people to go into economics, which is annoying because I think people who go into physics are interested in physics. The economics is not that interesting to sort of complexity-driven people. Yeah. So there's that problem. But still, you do need more people to go into that direction. If all the physicists in the world tomorrow decided to go and learn about economic theory, we would defeat neoclassical economics in
that would be awesome.
in a week. It would just disappear from the face of the earth. And other than those guys, the only ones you have left are the post-Keynesians.
Yeah, I think that there is also one thing we haven't mentioned is the historical school. Way back in the early 1900s, there's this whole debate between the Austrians and neoclassicals and the historicists. And this was a debate in Germany because they had these two schools. The historical school was we have to look at things historically and analyze every event as a unique historical thing. And then the Austrians and neoclassicals were saying, no, we have to have these theories that apply universally no matter what.
That's the same thing, though.
Yeah. What do
How
you
do
mean?
you-
How is that the same thing?
So, I mean, like, how do you get it? Never mind. Like, that's just a stupid, like, the theory that applies everywhere.
Yeah.
How do you know it applies everywhere if you don't, if it doesn't apply in history?
Yeah. So I think that like we kind of need to reactivate this historical school as well, but not like to take over everything. But I think that needs to be a central part of it in order to like kind of balance out this the theoretical part, because I think that there are certain like because in a way every event is unique, and like it's like human events are not quite the same as like in physics. So I think that like that needs to be investigated historically.
I don't know what you mean by that.
Yeah. You say you know, or you don't know?
I don't know what you mean by that. They're different from what they are in physics.
I guess, I mean, like, doesn't physics rely more on the idea that you have to like repeat something or be able to repeat something enough to get a general theory out of it?
To get to get a law, yeah, it has to be repeatable.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is like to some level, on some extent, like human events are not repeatable in that sense. Like every event is completely unique, or not completely unique, but like unique to enough of an extent.
Unique to an extent, yeah.
Yeah. So like, for example, the Great Depression has a certain character, but the recession of 2008 has like a different character, different circumstances.
Yeah.
So I just think that there needs to be like a historical analysis of that.
Sure.
Theory.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. I mean that. Oh, sorry. Yeah, that comes into the fact that it's just you can't really run an experiment with the economy. The economy is its own, like, it's self-perpetuating system. It doesn't require like experimentation. It's very hard to experiment with something so large and
did I forward you that link on the where the economists were experimenting with like online games? I think I said that to you, right?
You have, and that's actually really interesting. What they're finding is it doesn't work how they thought it would.
Right.
Look at that. Their models, like, at least in the article, that's what it said. Is they found like, oh, look, our models don't actually predict how the prices are going to fluctuate here.
Surprise.
Surprise, surprise. Your models don't work. Also, yeah, I mean, that's really cool, and that is perhaps some of the stuff they should do. But I think more than that, you just need non-economists to really take an interest in economics.
Yeah.
And to really try and figure it out.
Yeah, and they're going to want to defend their theories to the death, They're not going to want to give that up.
They will, exactly.
Yeah.
You need lots of smarter people. You need physicists and mathematicians to go into economics and point out its flaws.
Yeah.
Because those are like... Because the economists aren't going to listen to like political scientists and shit.
Right.
They're not going to listen to social scientists. But, disobeying the physicists, that's not something you want to do.
Yeah. Because they look up to physicists so much, I think. It's all physics envy.
They do, except like physicists, I don't even know if they do. They don't respect them.
Yeah.
At least they don't respect their views because they don't agree. Like anytime you put an economist and a physicist in a room together, they will inevitably disagree on a thing.
Yeah.
But it's just like I've seen at least the internet brand of libertarian are always just like talking about how the physicists are wrong about this and that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they don't even believe in global warming. So.
Do none of them believe in global warming?
I mean, for the most part, I don't think libertarians do. Because
that's messed up.
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's too much for them to handle, because they know that there would be no way for the market to, if it was real, they know that the market wouldn't be able to solve it. So
no, it will.
Therefore, it can't be real.
The market, the invisible hand of God, will magically distribute resources wherever they're needed.
Right.
Which is what physicists are trying to get us to do. It's interesting. I think Schumpeter was the Austrian economist who said that socialism will happen, but it'll happen more like endogenously, like capitalism will sort of naturally morph into it, not through a revolution like what Marx described. He said that there's going to be like this intelligentsia, this class of like intellectuals that are going to try to they're going to try to they're going to try to encourage a non-classist society, which will inevitably create socialism, which is what I suppose people like Noam Chomsky are kind of doing.
Yeah.
So I think he was much more like on the mark with that than.
Yeah,
Marx.
I mean, Schumpeter was kind of like an outlier. I mean, he's technically Austrian, and that.
No. I mean, just Austrian in the sense that he's ethnically Austrian. He's nothing like the other Austrians. He's nothing like them. Yeah. They didn't even they hated him. I think they like cast him out. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah, that's it. That's economic theory. I'm gonna put a link to Keen's book. It's available for free online. You can go read it. You should read it, especially if your name is Brian and you're intellectually wedded to the idea of neoclassical economics. If you're a libertarian, you should read it. Yeah, and you should just if you've ever learned economics and you think that and you use economics in your day-to-day reasoning, or just principles of economics in your day-to-day reasoning somehow, or in your moral reasoning, or in something, then you should go read this book, because it should make you doubt whether or not that all of that reasoning is well-founded. Yeah, I'm also going to put a link to Stephen Keen's YouTube channel, where he actually talks about his theories, where he has like his own lectures and stuff, if you're interested to learn about that. It's all post-Keynesian economics, so none of it will be like, none of it's going to be like fucking supply intersecting demand. Forget about that shit. But yeah, like every economically leaning person needs to read this book. I think it's just,
yeah,
it undermines their whole position on everything. However, if your view on libertarianism has nothing to do with economics and it's just a moral view, well, then we can have a different argument and discussion. If you just happen to just morally believe in the non-aggression principle or whatever. Anyhow, I think that's it. Farewell, folks. Say goodbye, Mike.
All right. Yeah, goodbye.